Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncover the mysteries and myths and legends behind history's most feared books. From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read. Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown? This is Season 1, Episode 9, Sepher Ha-Razim, The Secret Book of Angels and Magic. Let's dive in.
Okay, so today we're going deep into Sepher Ha-Razim,
We are.
or as it's also known, the Book of the Mysteries.
Right.
And this one is really something because it's not just some historical text, right? It's presented as this guide given to Noah before the flood.
By the angel Raziel, no less.
Exactly, by the angel Raziel. So you can imagine just the weight of that, receiving this divine knowledge just before the world as you know it is going to end.
Seriously, it's like, okay, I've got to build this ark.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's this book that's got all the secrets of the universe in it.
Yeah, it's like this cosmic instruction manual,
Right.
And the preface of the book, it claims to contain everything.
Oh, yeah.
From like the workings of the heavens to the movements of the stars, the names and authority of all these angelic beings.
And it's not just like highfalutin cosmic stuff, right?
No.
It's like very practical, too.
Yeah, so it talks about like rituals for life and death, how to distinguish good from evil, the ability to interpret dreams, even commanding spirits.
And like on the very practical side for Noah,
Yeah.
predicting weather patterns,
Yes.
knowing when there's going to be good harvests or bad harvests, peace or war, and even instructions on building the ark.
Right, so it's like this divine survival guide in a way.
It is. It really is. What does that tell you about the perceived importance of this knowledge at the time?
Well, I think it really speaks to the idea that, this wasn't just seen as some kind of theoretical knowledge, right? This was seen as practical, powerful information that could be used to navigate the challenges of life,
And potentially the end of the world.
especially the end of the world in this case, right?
Yeah.
And then it's interesting because it doesn't just end with Noah. This powerful knowledge was passed down through this lineage of biblical figures, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, eventually reaching King Solomon.
The wisest of them all.
Exactly, the wisest of them all. And supposedly Solomon saw it as like his most treasured book, right?
Wow.
The most potent book. And he used its wisdom to govern spirits and demons.
That is incredible. And I think what's so fascinating about this is that it connects this magical text to such foundational figures in Judaism. And it lends Sepher Ha-Razim this kind of prestige and authority, even though it resides outside the traditional biblical canon.
Right. And that raises the question of how these kinds of texts were viewed, and how they were transmitted within these religious traditions.
Absolutely. So we've got this incredible origin story, this almost mythical beginning. But what about the actual book itself? I mean, the one that scholars are looking at today, because the original artifact, if it ever existed in physical form, is certainly lost to us.
Yeah, definitely lost to us. So the Sepher Ha-Razim that we study now is actually reconstruction.
A reconstruction.
A reconstruction. And in 1966, a scholar by the name of Mordecai Margaliath, he was doing all this research on Kabbalistic literature, and he meticulously pieced together this text from a bunch of different Geniza fragments.
Now remind us what those are again.
So Geniza fragments, they are these incredible troves of discarded manuscripts that are found in synagogue storage rooms.
Oh, wow.
And, sometimes they're just like, little scraps of paper.
Right.
And sometimes they're more complete texts. And he also used other related magical writings that he found.
So he's like this historical detective, piecing together all these clues from all these different sources.
Exactly. It's like a giant puzzle.
It really is.
And so he identified 7 main codices or bound manuscripts that had relevant material in them. And he considered manuscript 1 to be the most reliable one. So he often used that one to kind of fill in the gaps or clarify parts that were unclear in other versions.
Gotcha.
And then manuscript 7, that one's interesting because it was an expanded edition and it actually had a Latin translation in it.
A Latin translation of this ancient Hebrew text that's purported to have been given to Noah by an angel and then passed down through all these Jewish patriarchs. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really speaks to, how this text traveled and how people saw its value across different cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the Sepher Ha-Razim we're talking about today is this fascinating kind of blend of various textual threads and historical moments.
Yeah.
And when you actually start reading it, you discover that it's structured according to a very specific cosmological framework.
Right, right. It reflects how people at the time thought about the universe.
Exactly, and it presents this cosmos that's structured with 7 firmaments, or layers of heaven.
7 layers of heaven.
7 layers.
And this model of the universe was actually pretty common during the Hellenistic period.
Okay.
And we see similar ideas in other literature from that time, like Talmudic writings, Enochic literature, and something called Hekaloth literature, which focuses on like these mystical ascents through the heavens.
So it's like this idea that the divine is progressively more remote?
Right.
So you need these intermediaries, these angelic overseers, to kind of interact with the human world.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have these 7 layers each with its own characteristics. Walk us through them.
Okay. So the first firmament is called Shamayim, and it contains 7 encampments.
Okay.
Each one is under the authority of an angelic overseer, and there are all these serving angels there too. It's like a celestial administration.
I like that.
You know, each division with its own specific purpose.
They've got their role.
They've got their roles, exactly. Then you move up to the second firmament, and this one's divided into 12 steps or levels.
Okay.
And each level is also governed by numerous angels.
Uh-huh.
And the idea is that you could potentially invoke these angels for various purposes. Then we get to the third firmament, which is ruled by 3 main angels, each commanding their own legions of angelic beings.
Legions of angels. It just paints this picture of this very populated and structured spiritual realm.
Yeah, it really does.
What about the higher firmaments?
Okay, so the fourth firmament gets even more celestial. It's divided between angelic princes who lead the sun during the day and then others who guide it through the night.
Okay.
So it's all about the movement of the sun.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then the fifth firmament is governed by 12 princes of glory, and they correspond to the 12 months of the year.
Okay, so there's like a connection to time there.
Yeah, definitely a connection to time. Then the sixth firmament is split between overlords of the east and the west, each with their own hierarchy of angelic leaders.
Wow, so we're getting up there in the hierarchy.
We're getting way up there.
Yeah.
And then finally, the seventh firmament gives us a description of the divine throne itself.
Oh, wow.
And it culminates in this long poetic doxology, which is basically a hymn of praise to the divine.
Okay, so a very meticulously ordered and hierarchical universe.
Very much so.
Now, I understand that each of these levels, except for the 7th, has specific magical practices associated with it. Is that right?
That is exactly right.
Okay, so it's basically like a how-to manual for interacting with the powers that were believed to reside within each of these cosmic layers.
Exactly. It's like a practical guide to celestial magic.
I love that.
Yeah.
And what are some of the underlying principles behind these magical practices?
So one of the key elements is this idea of sympathy and contagion.
Okay.
So the rituals often seem to mirror the attributes of the angels that are being invoked or the characteristics of the realm that they inhabit, for instance, angels associated with wrath. Those are the ones you'd invoke if you wanted to harm your enemies.
Right.
It's like the idea that like influences,
Okay.
and that things that were once connected, they still have this influence over each other.
Makes sense. So let's get into some of the specifics here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Give us some juicy details.
Yeah.
What kind of magical operations are we talking about?
Okay, so let's start with the first firmament, Shamayim. There's a healing ritual that involves burning myrrh and frankincense on coals at night. And while you're doing that, you have to recite the name of the overseer, WRPNYL, and the names of his 72 attendant angels.
So it's like a direct appeal to these celestial entities for help with healing.
Exactly. You're basically calling upon their power.
Now, I know there are some rituals in here that are a little less benevolent, shall we say.
Yeah, there are definitely some darker rituals.
Tell me about those.
So under the overseer TYGRH, still in the first firmament, there are some pretty aggressive rituals aimed at one's enemies.
Yep.
And one of these rituals involves collecting water from 7 different springs on the 7th day of the month at the 7th hour.
Very specific.
Very specific. And you have to use 7 unfired pottery vessels.
Wow.
And you expose this water to the starlight for 7 nights in a row. And then you pour it into a glass vial. And you say the name of your enemy, and you break the pottery vessels and throw the pieces in the 4 cardinal directions.
Oh.
And as you're doing that, you're reciting specific incantations that are designed to bring about all sorts of misfortune, like causing ships to capsize, walls to collapse, inflicting illness, and even banishing them into exile.
That is quite the ritual, and the breaking of the pottery, I guess, is symbolic of the desired outcome.
Right, it's like a physical representation of what you want to happen.
I got it. And what other surprises does this first firmament hold?
Well, there's also a divination ritual associated with the overseer, DNHL, and it's meant to reveal what's going to happen in the coming year.
Okay.
And this one involves writing down various possible events on strips of hieratic papyrus.
And what is that exactly?
Hieratic papyrus is a type of paper that was specifically used in ancient Egyptian priestly magic. So it suggests there's this connection to older magical traditions.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then you soak these strips of papyrus in spikenard oil inside a flask, and then you call upon the rising sun to reveal the future.
So even trying to find out what's going to happen in the future involve these elaborate procedures and calling upon these celestial powers?
Absolutely, it wasn't something to be taken lightly.
Okay, so let's move on to the fourth firmament, the one with the angels guiding the sun.
Okay, so in the fourth firmament, under the overseer KLMYYH, there's this ritual for getting the favor of a king.
Yeah.
And this one requires you to repeat a specific adjuration 21 times while staring at blood, and I don't think the text specifies whose blood.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, a little creepy, right?
Yeah.
And you're supposed to see a fiery coal descend from heaven as you're doing this.
That is quite the visual.
Yeah, very dramatic.
Now, are there any instances of love magic in Sepher Ha-Razim?
So also in the fourth firmament, there's this love magic ritual that involves collecting your own sweat.
Okay.
Yeah, and putting it on a small tin plate called a lamella, along with the names of specific angels, and then you bury this little plate under the doorstep of the person you have a crush on.
Interesting.
And the ritual specifies that it should be done during a full moon.
So connecting it to the moon and its associations with love and enchantment.
Exactly.
Full moon love magic.
A classic.
A classic indeed. Okay, what about the fifth firmament and those princes of glory who represent the months?
So in the fifth firmament, there's a divination ritual that's used to determine the month of your death.
Oh, wow, that's intense.
Yeah, or to see other future events.
Okay.
And you do this by writing the names of the 12 princes and their corresponding months on pieces of foil, and then you soak them in aged oil, and then you watch to see which piece floats to the surface.
Okay.
And the text really stresses that you need to purify yourself before you do this ritual.
So again, that emphasis on purity.
Right, because you're dealing with some serious knowledge here.
Absolutely. And the fifth firmament also describes how to make a protective ring.
It does. So you take those pieces of foil and some other materials and you put them in a silver ring, and this ring is supposed to ward off the evil eye and bad spirits.
Okay, so like a little amulet for protection.
Exactly.
Cool. What about the sixth firmament, where the spirits of the righteous dwell?
So in the sixth firmament, there's this ritual that's designed to make it look like you have a powerful escort with you. So you make an iron ring that has a gold plate in it with angelic names and a picture of a man and a serpent on it.
Interesting.
And when you're facing your enemies, you put this ring in your mouth and you recite a specific adjuration.
Wow, so it's like a way of magically intimidating your opponent.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about projecting an aura of power and protection.
Now finally, the seventh firmament, the throne of glory. Are there even rituals associated with this most sacred realm?
There is. So there's a ritual for acquiring hidden knowledge.
Okay.
And to do this, you have to abstain from certain foods and wine. You wear a new garment, you burn myrrh and frankincense, and then you call upon the overseer, BWL, and his angels by the sea or a river at night.
Good.
And the text says that you might see a pillar of fire with a cloud that looks like a human form.
So it's like a direct encounter with a powerful spiritual being.
Exactly. You're getting divine insight straight from the source.
That's intense. So given all these details and these incredibly complex practices, when do scholars believe that Sepher Ha-Razim was written?
So the general consensus, based on Margaliouth's research, is that the cosmological framework of the book dates back to the early 4th or late 3rd century CE.
Okay.
And there are a few reasons for this. So first, the text mentions Roman indictions, which means it couldn't have been written before 297 CE.
Okay.
And then the Hebrew that's used in the cosmological sections, it has characteristics that are typical of the Midrashic period in Jewish literature.
Gotcha.
And then many of the Greek words that are used in the text, those are technical terms that were associated with magical practices during that time period.
So the overarching structure of the book seems to align with that specific historical period. But what about those magical practices themselves? Do those have a separate history, maybe an older one?
Yeah, so that's an important point. Scholars have noticed that there are two main types of material in Sepher Ha-Razim.
Okay.
So you've got the cosmological framework, which we've been talking about, that has similarities to Hekaloth literature. And then you've got this collection of individual magical practices, and those look a lot like the stuff you find in the Greek magical papyri and Aramaic incantation bowls.
And what are those?
So those are texts that represent these broader magical traditions of the Greco-Roman world.
Gotcha. So it's almost like two separate layers that got combined.
Exactly. And most scholars think that these magical practices were already around before they got integrated into that 7 firmament structure that we see in Sepher Ha-Razim.
Okay.
So those practices might represent an earlier folk tradition.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the language in those sections, it's more straightforward and less fancy than the language that's used to describe the cosmological stuff.
Okay.
And then there's another interesting thing. The text blends Jewish ritual purity with practices that seem to call upon pagan deities like Helios, the Greek sun god.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and even Hermes and Aphrodite. And we even see practices that were specifically forbidden by rabbinic authorities, like making and using certain idols.
So it's like this really fascinating mix of Jewish, Greek, and even Egyptian ideas and practices.
Right. It shows you that religious boundaries back then were a lot more fluid than we might think.
So Sepher Ha-Razim gives us this really unique and maybe unexpected glimpse into the religious and magical world of that time period.
Yeah, it challenges our modern assumptions about how separate these different traditions were.
Absolutely. So it's an invaluable text for understanding that kind of syncretistic religious landscape of the Hellenistic era, and also the fact that humans have always been fascinated by magic and the unseen.
Exactly.
You know, you've got this complex cosmology, but then you also have this very practical, sometimes seemingly contradictory folk magic all in the same book.
Mhm.
And the fact that Margalieff reconstructed this text from discarded fragments that were found in synagogue storage rooms is just amazing in itself.
Yeah, it really is. It shows how even knowledge that seems lost or forgotten can be pieced back together.
And it gives us a look into these practices that maybe were considered a little bit fringe or even heretical by the mainstream religious authorities.
Yeah.
So it really makes you think about this persistent human desire to seek knowledge and influence the world through these esoteric means. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how that impulse has manifested throughout history and even today, are we still trying to do the same thing, just in different ways?
It's definitely something to think about.
It is.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this incredibly insightful deep dive into Sepher Ha-Razim.
My pleasure.
Until our next exploration into the unknown, keep turning those pages.